আজ আমাদের সঙ্গে আছেন বিশ্ববিখ্যাত অধ্যাপক প্রফেসর গায়ত্রী চক্রবর্তী স্পিভাক, লিটারি থিওরি, I would say philosophy of literature, philosophy of life, এই বিষয়গুলিতে প্রফেসর স্পিভাকের নাম সারা বিশ্ব জানে, কলাম্বিয়া বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ের অধ্যাপক। She is probably the most distinguished name in the international world of literary theory and literary philosophy, and every single citizen of this part of the country or India should feel very legitimately proud about her achievements and her contributions. But more important than that, for today's context, উনি একটা প্রজেক্ট নিয়েছেন যেটা হচ্ছে বাংলা ভাষার ক্লাসিক্সগুলিকে, হাজার বছরের ইতিহাসের বাংলা সাহিত্যের ইতিহাস থেকে বেছে বেছে ক্লাসিক্সগুলিকে একটা খুব প্রেস্টিজিয়াস সিরিজে কলাম্বিয়া ইউনিভার্সিটি থেকে পাবলিশ করা। She wants to get translated by the most competent authors across the world, the chosen 50 or 100 classics of our 1,000-year-old literature. And this raises the question whether, for the veteran professor that she is it a kind of homecoming, kind of retreat from the cosmopolitical or cosmopolitan world that she usually inhabits to her home, which is Bengal? Professor Spivak, will you say it's a homecoming for you?
Yes. The short answer is yes. But what is interesting, Alapan, first of all, thank you for that very nice introduction. And I rely on my beloved friends like Alapan Bandyopadhyay to keep telling people that what I say might matter. But nonetheless, I would say what is interesting about Bangla or Bengali is that that return, the homecoming, is also a species of historical cosmopolitanism. This thing that today we have only one idea of the global, which is basically controlled by the large, old imperial powers. But if one really, I am after all a historically inclined, philosophically inclined literary critic, if one looks at the historical, then one would see that the possibility of cosmopolitanism, diversified cosmopolitanisms, in fact existed long before this kind of unitary globalization began to cramp us all into English and French, Russian and perhaps Chinese, and so on. So therefore, my answer to you is first, yes, very much yes, homecoming. But it is not a homecoming that takes me away from the cosmopolitan. It is a homecoming that restores to me and to other people who share Bengali and perhaps even don't, the possibility of seeing what cosmopolitanism carries as history. Is that an answer?
I absolutely understand, Professor. In fact, you know Milindo, Shuhatri, the young researchers who admire you and who have been following your literature very avidly. Some of them were telling me when I was getting ready for this interview, in fact they gave me all the materials, that probably for you this inter-language movement is finally a question of social justice. In a great essay you write, it's a great step towards the ability to win social justice for all. In fact, when you famously translated Draupadi of Mahashweta Devi, you indicated that probably in Draupadi, the raped girl, the raped Adivasi girl, probably in her you had seen a kind of onslaught against not only the villainous Sena Nayaka, the army leader, but also a shadow of the arrogance of the first world. In your own writing, the famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, you found in Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri, the menstruating lady who committed suicide, again our iconic Draupadi. So on all these figures, you, as you yourself said, you are locating the voice of the third world, and third world and subalternity get a kind of dignified movement through translation, would you say?
Yes. These are excellent questions that I'm able to answer positively right away. Let me start at the end. Draupadi. You see, I was just talking about this in Sharjah. People were speaking of translations and creolization. See, creolization is a very important idea in translation. Dante's De Vulgari Eloquentia, of popular eloquence, vulgar eloquence, actually in the 13th century speaks of all of the Italians as Latin Creole, and then thinks of the Latin Creole, that is, although Tuscan, his own language, is the most beautiful, the one that is spoken at court, that's the one that we should do something about. If you think about our great old poets who knew the Prakrits, who knew them, I mean, Kalidas, you can see, he's not just writing in Sanskrit if you're reading it in the original. It's not just written in Sanskrit, is it? No. And the examples in Anandavardhana and so on and so forth, most of them, not all, are from Prakrit. So that they had a sense that the natural language, the Prakrit, the Creole, was first. You refined it, you samskared it, and it became Sanskrit. But that's what comes originally, right? So that to an extent, translation itself is a kind of creolization, which immediately, and here I would correct the younger people just a little. You know, the young have a certain kind of excitement, which is a good thing, but it needs to be tempered if it's going to really become practical. They have to realize that creating an opposition between a third world, which kind of collapsed because of nationalism some time ago, our Bandung, 1955, it collapsed for these kinds of reasons. We don't really want to make these distinctions. We want to undo these distinctions, and only the literary can. You know, the Sahitya, it has a Sahitaness. And if you think of the world's wealth of languages, what is the literary called, let's say, in the very powerful language of Nigeria? And Nigeria doesn't have just one. What does Igbo call the literary? So to that extent, I would say that no, I don't create an opposition. I acknowledge, and so I'll begin at the end. I was talking about this in Sharjah. Said Draupadi didn't just take her clothes off and frighten Shinanak. As she went forward towards him, saying, asking him to do something with her naked body, she wasn't asking for rape. If you remember the story, what she says is, counter kar, counter kar. And counter is encounter, isn't it? And even encounter is a fake word. Today we know about fake news. A fake word which disguises the fact that it was a death in police custody without charge and without any kind of investigation at all. So she's translating. Her last act is not one of just something with the body. She's translating. So that we have to, if we know how to read and act on reading, we want to connect this to your first question. You discover, and this is why I want to present this, not just me, but also my friend Shankhu Ghosh, who unfortunately is gone. He was the senior editor, and I threw it at Shankhu, saying, Shankhu, it is you who knows Bengali. I just love Bengali. There's a difference. So you help me. Ilahi, madad kare. And he did. And then we began. So that's why I would like to say to your first question, let's discover that cosmopolitan gesture of translating police doublespeak on the part of a so-called illiterate, naked tribal. Who is the agent of creolization and a powerful translation here? That's what we teach when we invite our readers into this extraordinary feast of poetry and literature. You know, I mean, can I just mention something here which is perhaps a little? Do you want to put with Draupadi, Pullorar Baramasha? Think of it. Think of it. They used to make us read it in high school. Who cared? Who cared? It was a high school thing. Never paid any attention to it. I just happened to, and I've even written on Choni Mongol Kabo. I never paid any attention to it. But the other day, I was just reading it on my own because I wanted to find out what Bharenda was. Bharenda Bhadche, I told someone. And the word Bharenda is in Pullorar Baramasha. Bharendar Kham hoi ache Moddhogare. So I thought, okay, if I look at the annotations on Pullorar Baramasha, maybe I'll find. And I began reading it and I thought, my goodness, I can't believe this piece existed so long ago. So you see, if you want to look at the track in our Bengali literature of the diversification of the cosmopolitical, the diversification of the cosmopolitan, you can do it without dividing in some crazy modern way the third world and the first world. If I really despised the first world, do you think I would have lived there for 60 years? Don't you think I love my students? Most of them belong to the first world, don't forget. I would have left. No. I don't acknowledge that kind of division. Neither of them is monolithic. If you want general social justice, it has to be. See, somebody from a journal was asking me, Shokoler ekta sharbik shikriti to na shokole na adibashider sharbik shikriti to ekta darkar ache oi naka banglaয়. So I said to him, bhai shudhu adibashider কেন? সকলের দরকার আছে সার্বিক স্বীকৃতি। এইটা যদি বুঝতে না পারা যায় তাহলে গণতন্ত্র বলে কিছু নেই। সুতরাং এই ছেলে মানুষদের আমি বলবো সংযত হও একটুখানি।
No, Professor, they absolutely understand. They are mainly saying that probably, like as in Derrida, you discovered that ethnocentrism was something that the philosopher Derrida, whom you translated to the entire world, was suggesting. Similarly, the logocentrism which Derrida was fighting, probably the over-West centricity and the need, the imperative to discover multiple loci of the world drove you, if I may ask, did it drive you to discover, rediscover, to emphasize, underline the Draupadis, the Gandharis of the world? When you were discussing things with Professor Bimal Krishna Motilal, you write that Draupadi, Gandhari, Duryodhan, they repeatedly came back. And you yourself wrote Song for Kali, invoking Ram Prasad. Then in your several articles, Monosha, Mirabai of Rajasthan, Chondi of Kobi Kankan, they all come. Do they all come to puncture the dominant narrative of globalization as it is often portrayed? That's
no, they come on their own. They are not reactive to anything. As far as I'm concerned, they're not reactive to anything. And I can say a lot of very awful things about Chondi also. So it's I am not at all, deshe deshe mor ghar ache. I am not interested in being anyone's enemy. I think the first thing that Taraknath Sen taught us, now I understand, going back to that stuff, is how to say yes to the enemy. I just said to a class of undergraduates at Binghamton University, which is a pretty good state university in New York, right? One of my former students teaches there. He's inherited a literary theory course, which is indeed only white folks, except Gayatri Spivak and Franz Fanon. So since I was on their syllabus, I said, Surya, let me teach. So suddenly, in about 1 minute, I was in my hospital room. So I started teaching them on Zoom. And I said to them, listen, the first thing to learn, একজন বলছে যে আমার তো ঘুম পায় পড়তে গেলে, তখন আমি বলছি যে এই যে ঘুম যে পায় আমি কি দেখতে চাই, what do I want? I want that at the end of the course, you're not feeling sleepy anymore. Can we make that happen? Ghum pai because you haven't been taught well enough to be prepared to read this stuff. Okay? So let's try together. So আমি বললাম যে dead white males. No, they are not dead white males. They're human beings. Why these people were given importance is something that you folks are participating in. I don't care what color your skin is. You are the children of a superpower. So look at, because after all they're in the United States, look at your complicity with these people. Don't your parents pay income tax here? There's 58 cents to the dollars going on defense. So therefore, remember that you are folded together with these people whom you're calling dead white male, even if you're yellow or red or green or blue in color. So therefore, think about it and try to see if you can say yes to the enemy. And I gave them Shelley. I said, Shelley was totally British Empire, a good-looking guy, and I generally despise good-looking men because they are so full of nonsense towards us. I know, having been a young, good-looking woman, I do not like good-looking men. And so, number one. Number two, he certainly treated women incredibly poorly. Nonetheless, from this British Empire guy, I have learnt something. Do you know what? That he was able to say, we do not know, we cannot imagine. We cannot imagine what we know. Can you understand that sentence? I don't think so, because I can't either. People say too quickly, oh yes, they've understood what you've said. No, sir, they haven't, because I haven't understood what I've said. This slow desire to learn from the enemy something that you learn in spite of the fact that there are reasons why they are your enemy. That's the only thing I can teach my students, because they are all over the world. Okay? Yesterday, someone was telling me on the train that my school, diocesan, has now become less good because I forget the percentage, 21% have become Muslims students. I took a look at her. I didn't try to teach her anything because I couldn't teach her anything, but at least I scared her. She was really being nice to me. She had recognized who I was, etc., etc. She wanted to pronamify, etc. I really tried to scare her. I tried to frighten her into thinking that it was absolutely unacceptable to say a thing like that to someone like me, that I was a very powerful person and she should watch what she says. You know what I mean? So that kind of thing is what I do in various ways, low with the low, trying to be high with the high, although I laugh inside, not to allow people to have enemies.
Professor, to come back once more to the prestigious and extremely laudable project that you have embarked upon, which frankly excites us, to get launched international quality translations of our literature in the world arena. Even if we are not allowed to be chauvinistic, or even if we are not expected to be oppositional, rightly so, would we say that this search for plurality of voices has a nobility of its own, as you yourself say, wonderfully say, I would say. Capital asks for the destruction of the Tower of Babel. In the global context, the Tower of Babel is our refuge. বহু স্বরে আমাদের মুক্তি, একটা অসাধারণ প্রবন্ধে লিখছেন অধ্যাপক স্পিভাক। আমাদের প্রশ্ন এই যে অসাধারণ বহুভাষিক অনুবাদে বহুভাষিক অঙ্গনে পৌঁছে যাবে আমাদের মাতৃভাষার শ্রেষ্ঠ সম্পদগুলি, এর মধ্যে কি আছে এক ধরনের নৈতিক বৈধতা?
অবশ্যই আছে, অবশ্যই আছে। কেননা আমি যে কথাগুলি বলছিলাম তার মানে তো নয় যে রেজিস্ট্যান্সের দরকার নেই, এনমিটির দরকার নেই, সবসময় আত্মপ্রশংসার দরকার নেই, কিন্তু রেজিস্ট্যান্সের এই যে ভুবনেশ্বরী ভাদুরীর কথা তুমি বলছিলে, তিনি কি করলেন? তিনি ব্যবহার করলেন মেনস্ট্রুয়েশনকে as an instrument of communication of patriarchal resistance, anti-patriarchal resistance. তিনি সুতরাং এই যে she was not a victim, she used it to communicate, and women in her family didn't hear her. Therefore, in rage, I said, the subaltern cannot speak. She did speak. She spoke with her body. So to an extent, absolutely, Alapan, the idea of saying to the readership in the world, look what we have. This is absolutely a gesture which restores, not just as an intellectual, literary intellectual, more than the ethical or the moral, as an intellectual, a professor, I'm interested in what is correct. This is the correct picture of the world. You know, we work in the so-called development lobby. For the development lobby, the world's wealth of languages is an inconvenience. Whereas the World Health Organization, all of these general organizations are saying we must communicate with the folks who are developed. What languages do they speak? Unsystematized mother tongues in Africa, extraordinary pre-digital, digital languages, oral languages, head computer. To an extent, the entire idea of restoring the world's wealth of languages, which is an impractical idea because there are too many. So this has only be collective, right? This idea, this huge, beautiful moral, this huge idea, our work, but anybody can only do this work with their mother tongues, right? So I'm going forward, Shankha and I, and all the others, folks like you who will join us in our work, we are going together, coming home, but also with our mother tongue. Because I teach comparative literature, and the ideal of comparative literature is to recognize that any language, even a language that's getting extinguished, only one person can speak it, any language can be a first language. And a first language, you may want to call it a mother tongue, a first language is the one which is learnt before the head opens, you know, when you're in your mother's arms. And so therefore, that language opens up the meaning-making system inside which operates ethics before you actually learn a language properly. So therefore, yes, this huge collectivity of the acknowledgement of the world's wealth of languages must begin mother tongue by mother tongue as folks humbly inhabit the general human tendency to want to go home, whatever they've done, however successful they are. And this is why I was so pleased that you began with that question, and there is indeed something moral about it. What? The acknowledgement of the humanness of the human, that we are all brothers and sisters.
Professor, a tentative question. Would you say in this commonwealth of languages, in the age of globalization, some languages like ours are getting subalternized? Would you say Bengali today is a subaltern language, and to the extent celebration of subalternity is a morally legitimate exercise, this project of yours is a supremely legitimate exercise because it uplifts the subaltern?
I'm glad you think about it that way, but I will ask you to think about it also in other ways. I think what you're saying is interesting and important. But I would also say that, you know, I work with a very interesting but in some ways tight definition of the subaltern, which of course I get from the great Italian literary critic. Actually, his degree was in philology, which is what literary criticism was in those days, University of Turin. See, he was to an extent a subaltern himself, son of an Albanian immigrant and so on. And his notion of his question was, can one write the history of the subaltern? And he defined the subaltern very simply as small groups on the margins of history. In other words, not enough organized material to enter the historical. And so if one looks at that, and then of course as he began working with the Sardinians, which is where he was from. Now subalternity is a very dreadful thing. So he also looked at the fact that the subaltern is not to be romanticized. The subalternity is to be destroyed, because subalternity is something that gives the person who is a subaltern no access to citizenship. Today it takes the vote with violence, but gives no access to citizenship. With subalternity, you do not understand that the citizen runs the state. So to an extent, subalternity is a position. It's not a rounded description of certain kinds of human beings. At least that's the way we work, not only in the classroom, but also in the field. I mean, yes, I just came last night from my little schools, and this is how we discuss these things. So I would say that yes, Bengali is being subalternized. On the other hand, if you recognize, as did my very dear friend Ngugi wa Thiong'o, whom I met in 1966 when he was 38 is where he was born. He was 26 and I was 24. And when he was James Ngugi, he says that he instrumentalizes the big languages. He says, look, for the business of running the world governance, we need these. I mean, even Kiswahili is a big lingua franca. We need some of these big languages, instrumental. Then you don't acknowledge subalternization, because you're not trying to make up these huge translated words in elite Bengali in order to talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Bengali, when the actual subalterns, because I work with them, they're not using the word nijatan. They're using the word harassment. Harassment, they have creolized it, like counter. You know what I'm saying? So therefore, I would say that Bengali will not acknowledge subalternization if it refuses to pretend that apart from the definite usefulness of Bengali in offices here in the state and somewhat in political ways in the center, limited. We cannot forget that Bengali is also today the national language of Bangladesh, where it is prospering greatly. In fact, Bengali is not a language of world governance because, next sentence, the language of world governance is obliged to be existentially impoverished. You understand what I'm saying? So that on the other side is not subalternization. The other side is learning, as through our series, and acknowledging that this can only be a collectivity, and the world's wealth of languages is not a menagerie of subalternized languages. That's the United Nations preserving everything.
Gayatri has agreed to speak to us, basically expecting that all of us, to the extent possible, will be inspired and excited by the project, and to the extent possible, many of us should come forward to contribute to the wonderful project which she has launched. And my last question in this tenor would be, Professor, would you say this project of yours, you have been going to the Bengal-Bihar, Bengal-Jharkhand borders in Purulia. You have been, despite you are more than 80 now, you have just crossed your 80th birthday, taking all the troubles that one has to take. You are going to those areas, you are mingling with the Adivasis, the real cutting edges of the society where all these languages do not reach. You have been teaching them and you have been learning from them, as you insist, which again enriches your contributions towards plurality. Would you say it is also a political act for them, to the extent in a book of yours recently you have said states are becoming neo-patrimonial, the dignity imparted to their language in the Committee of Nations, in language that is understood by the whole world, that is a political act for the final favor devastated real subaltern citizen of ours too.
Yes, I mean, as I mentioned before, I was with them yesterday, and the thing is, once again, you'll see, what do I say to them? What I say to them as, you know, we think about Bengali, and it's very, very helpful that my financial officer for the foundation in New York, it's a tiny foundation, Laura Metzger, gave me $10,000 for rural teaching when she died. She was only an English teacher, fantastic woman. His name is Surya Parekh, right? And he's been learning enough Bengali that he can, you know, I can dictate emails to him in Bengali, etc., etc. Suryada. Now, the thing is, it's very important for them to see that, you know, before that it was an English, a white English guy who was learning Bengali because he had read something of mine which said if you want to study 19th century colonialism, you need to know one of the languages. This small thing is important for them. But now, when I talk to them about the fact that, you know, because after all, I'm not going to go into long narratives, but they are aware of the history of our wanting support for this excellent, absolutely excellent project. And so I share everything with them. And so I was saying how we were going to be, when this was important, what I wanted there to be was for their children. Because today, they may know that their Bengali is being enhanced, but they will not be able to understand the extraordinary wealth of the language of our literature, our literary tradition. They will have to wait. And when I speak to them about why they should therefore think about the Durpalla, because remember, the subaltern can't think about the Durpalla. That's one of the problems. They just think so far. Anyway, if they're illiterate, can't count beyond 10. So therefore, when I ask them to think about the Durpalla, I wish I could go on for hours on this topic. Alapan, you'll see how hard it is. Then I say to them, খালি ছেলে মেয়েদের কথা তো নয়, ছেলে মেয়েদের কথা চিন্তা করতে পারো না, because we talk also about how the world is being destroyed, and they're getting extremely inspired about these things. And within it, we put this project where their children can, or their children's children, can expect to share with the world's readership something that belongs to them. Vidyasagar comes in just a little bit. They know Vidyasagar only as the author of Barnaparicha and Dharapat. Good enough, because we use those two as texts. But yes, I do speak to them about the far future for which they must focus themselves in order to save the world, keep the world, and within it the possibility of their children looking at something which they cannot yet understand.
Thank you, Professor. I really thank you for such extremely lucid explication of the excellent project that we have kindly launched, and I appeal to all to kindly come forward for reasons ethical, for reasons political, for reasons historical, for reasons existential. We must get this project to a level where getting translated our own classics in the International Committee of Nations before the commonwealth of languages that we have in an acceptable global language, which is English, is very important, and we must all unite our resources to get these classics really, really translated in English by very professional, very competent translators chosen by Gayatri and others without any further delay. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Hands open.